You've heard of police dogs, service dogs, but what if I told you a quiet farm dog in Montana led a team of strays to defend a town from something no one expected? Not once, not twice, but again and again, without orders, without fear, and without ever asking for praise. This isn't just a story about a dog. It's about faith, instinct, and a guardian sent when no one else could protect us. If you believe God still sends protectors in unexpected forms, share this story with someone who needs hope. Comment, Amen, if you believe in quiet miracles. And subscribe to our channel for more true stories that will restore your faith. May the Lord bless you and keep you. Amen if you believe. The wind rolled low across the open fields of Bozeman, Montana, carrying with it the smell of early frost and pine sap. It was late October, and the days had grown short and quiet, the skies often washed in the grays of approaching snow. The mornings were sharp with cold, and mist clung to the grass like breath that refused to vanish. Tom Walker had lived here for nearly 4 decades, long enough to know the rhythm of this land, when the elk returned, when the coyotes grew bold, and when something wasn't quite right. Tom was a man built like the land he worked on, broad-shouldered, sun-aged, with a slow, deliberate way of moving. 62 years old, his beard silver and thick, he favored flannel shirts tucked into worn jeans and a cap that read Montana Livestock Association. A lifetime bachelor, Tom was reserved by nature, but not unkind. He trusted animals more than people and talked to his herd more than he did his neighbors. Loss had shaped him. A tractor accident years ago had taken his brother, and ever since, Tom had walked with a limp that made him favor his left side. The land, the animals, they had become his way of coping. And among those animals, one companion stood out. Ranger was a 5-year-old German shepherd, large and imposing in frame, with a deep chestnut coat dappled with black that shimmered like oil in the sun. His ears stood sharp, eyes always alert, and his movements were taut with control. He had once been part of a K-9 training program, but had been dismissed for what they called emotional overresponsiveness, a trait that Tom had found instead to be a kind of beautiful instinct. Ranger didn't just listen, he understood. He had a tendency to sit still for long minutes, staring into the distance, nose twitching as if sniffing for more than just prey. Tom often joked he was half dog, half spirit. Over the past week, Ranger had been behaving strangely. Every night, around 2 or 3 a.m., he would rise from his spot on the porch and begin barking, deep, guttural sounds that weren't meant for Tom or the cattle. He always barked in the same direction, toward the thick grove of pines bordering the southern edge of the property, where the pasture dipped into shadow and the old fence had long since given up fighting the elements. Tom had gone out once or twice with a flashlight, finding nothing but cold air and silence. "It's probably just coyotes," he'd muttered, but even as he said it, he hadn't believed it. Ranger didn't bark at coyotes. He chased them. The barking grew worse. On the 7th night, Tom had to pull Ranger back by the collar, his muscles taut as bowstrings, his fur standing like a bristle brush down his back. The dog didn't growl. He vibrated with something closer to alarm than aggression. That was when Tom decided he'd check the pasture at first light. Dawn came late, filtering pale gold through the trees. The ground crunched underfoot with brittle frost. Tom sipped lukewarm coffee from a metal thermos as he and Ranger walked the fence line. The cattle were clustered to the north end, chewing lazily, unconcerned. Nothing seemed amiss until they neared the bottom edge of the property, where the grass gave way to a slight dip and the shade from the pines lingered even after sunrise. That's where they found it. A young goat, no more than a year old, lay crumpled in the frost. Its neck twisted unnaturally, eyes wide open. The body bore no puncture marks, no torn flesh, just long, deep indentations across its torso, as if it had been wrapped, squeezed, crushed. Tom froze. He'd seen mountain lion kills. He'd seen wolf takedowns. This was different. "Jesus," he whispered, kneeling down. Ranger, for his part, didn't approach the body. He circled it once, nose low, then moved off into the brush, following something Tom couldn't see. The dog's tail was stiff, body low to the ground, moving with the silent fluidity of a hunter. Tom rose and followed, pushing through dried ferns and tangled grass. A trail had been left. Not hoof prints or paw tracks, but a long dragging line punctuated by wide, sweeping patterns. Something had pulled the goat, not carried it, through the undergrowth. They followed the drag marks for almost 30 yards before it abruptly stopped. The grass was flattened in a wide circular patch, the earth disturbed, but whatever had been there was long gone. Ranger stood still, staring into the woods, ears twitching. "What the hell are you seeing?" Tom murmured. That's when Lily Adams appeared at the fence, clutching a small notebook and a worn backpack decorated with bright patches of dinosaurs and stars. Lily was 10, small for her age, with a mop of chestnut curls and wide, sharp eyes. She lived with her grandmother 2 properties down, and often came to the Walker Ranch after school to watch the animals from behind the fence. She was shy, especially around dogs, but always polite. There was a quietness to her that Tom recognized, the kind born of grief. Her mother had died in a car accident a year prior. Since then, Lily had grown afraid of loud noises, sudden movements, and dogs. Especially big ones. But Ranger was different. She wouldn't touch him, not yet. But she watched him with a curious silence that was different from fear. That morning, she sat on the top rail of the wooden fence, sketching. Tom waved. "Morning, Lily." She nodded, eyes on Ranger. "He's barking a lot lately." "Yeah," Tom said. "You hear that too, huh?" Lily didn't answer immediately. "He's looking for something." Tom considered that, then turned back to Ranger. The dog was now sitting, staring toward the trees again, still and quiet. The wind picked up, tugging dry leaves across the ground like whispers. Something in Tom's chest tightened. He crouched down and ran his hand along Ranger's thick coat. "We'll figure it out, buddy." That night, the barking returned. Sharper, shorter, like an alarm, not a warning. Ranger stood at the edge of the porch, tail straight, nose pointing toward the grove. Tom didn't stop him this time. He just watched. Because whatever was out there, it wasn't done. The cold had thickened overnight, hardening the earth and painting frost on the window panes of Tom Walker's cabin. The sky above Bozeman was low and heavy, pale gray with a suggestion of snow in the coming days. The pine trees that lined the southern edge of the ranch stood like dark sentinels, unmoved by wind but ever watching. Tom stood on his porch with a tin mug of black coffee, wrapped in his old brown coat, the wool collar turned up against the chill. At his feet, Ranger sat with ears forward, tail flat, eyes locked on the forest again. For the second morning in a row, something unspoken passed between them. Tom didn't need words. He knew the look in Ranger's eyes. Something was out there. Tom was about to head back inside when a faint rustle pulled Ranger to his feet. The German shepherd, built with taut muscle and grace, moved without hesitation off the porch. "Hold on," Tom muttered, setting down his coffee and grabbing his rifle from inside the door. The rifle was old but reliable, a Remington 700 with a walnut stock and a story for every scratch in its wood. Slinging it over his shoulder, he followed Ranger, who had already begun weaving through the tall grass near the grove's edge. The trees closed in quickly, shadows thickening where sunlight failed to reach. This part of the property wasn't fenced. Nature had claimed it long before Tom bought the land. Fallen branches and moss-covered stones littered the narrow path as they ventured deeper. Ranger paused, sniffed the ground, then moved forward faster, his pace quickening. Tom picked up his stride, his breath becoming visible in the morning air. That's when he heard it, a strangled cry, somewhere between a gasp and a bleat. They crested a low rise, and there it was. A young deer, likely no more than a yearling, lay twitching on the forest floor, its limbs splayed at unnatural angles, eyes wide with terror. Wrapped around its body was something horrifying. A massive Burmese python, coiled in thick loops, its pale yellow and brown pattern stark against the fallen leaves. The snake's head hovered just above the deer's shoulder, tongue flicking, jaw beginning to widen in preparation for the slow and brutal task of devouring its kill. Tom froze. "That's not possible," he whispered. Burmese pythons weren't native here. This was Montana, not the Everglades. But the evidence lay thick before him. The python had to be at least 16 feet long, as thick as a grown man's thigh. Its body rippled with muscle, and its eyes gleamed with an ancient, unfeeling hunger. Ranger didn't hesitate. With a growl low in his throat, he leapt forward. Tom opened his mouth to call him back, but it was already too late. The dog moved like a missile, fast, silent, focused. The python reacted, tightening its coils around the deer, but Ranger didn't aim for the body. He darted around the side, snapping his jaws toward the snake's head, forcing it to raise up in defense. The two creatures circled one another, predator versus predator. Ranger feinted left, then lunged right, his teeth clamping onto the snake's neck just below the jaw. The python thrashed violently, trying to wrap its tail around the dog, but Ranger was quicker. He twisted, pulling the snake's head back while his hind legs dug into the dirt for leverage. It was a desperate ballet of instinct and calculation. Tom raised his rifle but couldn't get a clean shot. Ranger and the snake were too entangled. Instead, he moved closer, keeping his eye on the chaos before him. The deer, astonishingly, gave a last gasp and jerked free of the loosened coils, scrambling off into the brush. Ranger shifted tactics. He released the python's head, danced back, then lunged for the midsection. He sank his teeth deep, shaking his head with feral power. The python reared and struck, but Ranger had already moved. The snake's jaw snapped at empty air. With a second bite, this time at the tail, Ranger managed to twist the snake partially onto its side. And then, finally, the python released its grip completely and began to retreat. Injured and stunned, it slithered into the underbrush, leaving behind streaks of blood and crushed leaves. Ranger chased it to the edge of the grove, then stopped. He didn't pursue. He stood panting, eyes fixed on the shadows where the snake had vanished, chest heaving. Tom rushed to him, kneeling beside his companion. "You okay?" he asked, running his hand down Ranger's side. There were no bites, but his fur was matted with dirt and sweat. The dog didn't respond with a bark or a tail wag. He simply stared forward, unmoving, like a soldier after battle. From the tree line, a quiet voice broke the moment. "Was that a snake?" Tom turned. Lily Adams stood about 30 feet away, her sketchbook clutched to her chest, eyes wide. Her coat was too thin for the weather, and her nose was red from the cold, but her expression was different from fear. It was awe. "I told my grandma I was going to draw the cows," she said softly, stepping closer. "But I saw you going into the trees, and I followed." Tom opened his mouth to scold her, but stopped. There was something resolute in her gaze, as if seeing Ranger defend that deer had unlocked something in her, a courage long buried. "You shouldn't be here," he said finally. "But I'm glad you are." She walked slowly to Ranger, crouching nearby. She didn't try to touch him, not yet, but opened her sketchbook. "I want to draw this. Him. That thing he did." Tom nodded. "He saved a life today. Maybe two." Ranger turned and looked at Lily. For the first time, he stepped toward her, head low, tail relaxed. She flinched slightly, but didn't move away. Ranger paused beside her and sat. They stayed like that for several minutes, man, dog, and child, wrapped in silence deeper than the forest around them. The wind had shifted. It no longer carried just the usual scent of pine needles and smoke from the neighboring cabins' chimneys. Now there was something else in the air, an unease that Tom Walker couldn't quite name, but felt in the way the cattle grouped tighter, in the way Ranger sat still for hours, nose pointed toward the south like a compass stuck on danger. The day after the encounter with the python, Tom had called the county wildlife authority. He hadn't expected much. Montana wasn't known for invasive reptiles, and the thought of someone believing he'd seen a Burmese python in the woods felt absurd. Still, the memory of Ranger's snarling teeth and the crushed deer on the forest floor wouldn't let him sleep. That afternoon, a silver government SUV rolled down the gravel road leading to the Walker Ranch, raising a slow cloud of dust behind it. The door opened and out stepped Emily Dawson. She was in her early 40s, lean and upright, her posture a quiet blend of military efficiency and scientific poise. Her hair was pulled into a low, tight bun under a wildlife service cap, and her face bore the kind of lines carved not by vanity, but by years spent outdoors under sun and snow. Her eyes, a sharp hazel, moved quickly, assessing the land and the man before her without hesitation. Dressed in olive tactical gear, utility vest, and waterproof boots, she looked more like a search and rescue lead than a wildlife biologist. "Mr. Walker," she said, extending a gloved hand. "Emily Dawson, U.S. Fish and Wildlife. You called about an invasive snake sighting." Tom shook her hand. "Didn't think they'd send someone this quick." She gave a tight smile. "Normally we wouldn't. But when the words Burmese python and Montana forest show up in the same call, we take it seriously. Mind showing me the site?" Tom nodded and whistled for Ranger, who emerged from under the porch. Emily's eyes tracked the dog as he trotted up, sitting beside Tom like a sentinel. "That your dog?" "Ranger," Tom said simply. "He found the kill. Drove the snake off too." Emily crouched down slightly, studying the German shepherd with curiosity. "Canine unit?" "Was," Tom replied. "Didn't pass final certification. Said he was too reactive." She raised an eyebrow. "Too reactive?" "He looks calm to me. Knows when to be calm. Knows when not to." They headed toward the grove, Tom leading with Ranger at his side, Emily just behind, scribbling notes into a waterproof field notebook. At the spot where the deer had nearly died, Emily examined the flattened grass, the blood, and a few remaining tracks. She knelt, pulling out a small ruler and camera, photographing the width of the drag marks. No bite wounds. No claw marks. Deep symmetrical impressions along the torso. "You were right, constriction kill," she muttered, almost to herself. Tom folded his arms. "So, it really was a python?" "Burmese python, by the look of it. Juvenile, possibly female. Likely between 15 and 18 feet long. Big, but not full grown." Tom shook his head. "What the hell is it doing here?" Emily stood and looked out toward the distant creek. 2 weeks ago, a reptile transport truck crashed 40 miles east, just past Livingston. The driver was killed. He was unlicensed, transporting exotic animals for underground trade. Authorities recovered most of the reptiles, but 5 snakes, all adult Burmese pythons, were unaccounted for. Tom swore under his breath. "You're saying this wasn't just a freak accident?" "I'm saying there are more," Emily said calmly. "And if they've made it this far west, they're following water. This land here, it's perfect. Tall grass, slow-moving creeks, and prey animals everywhere. Ranches like yours, full of goats and sheep, are practically a buffet." Ranger growled low. He'd wandered toward the creek's edge, staring into the brush. Emily followed his gaze. "He's sharp. Smarter than most people I know," Tom muttered. Emily glanced back at the dog. "What happened with his training?" Tom hesitated. He was brought in after his previous handler, a Marine, died during a domestic deployment. Ranger shut down for months. Didn't eat. Didn't move. When he came back to training, he was sharper, faster, but they said he was too sensitive. Picked up on things too quickly. Reacted too fast. He wasn't a fit for standardized protocol. Emily knelt and made a clicking sound with her tongue. But he responded to a python. That's not just reaction. That's assessment. Tom didn't say anything, but the pride in his face answered for him. Emily straightened and looked toward the south. "I'll need to set up thermal traps along the creek. If even one of these snakes finds a breeding pocket, it'll be Florida all over again. But in snow." Tom rubbed his chin. "They'll survive here? If they've adapted enough to hunt, they're already halfway to survival. Pythons don't freeze easy, not when they've found heat sources, barns, compost piles, insulated brush. We've underestimated them before." Just then, a distant rumble echoed across the field, a generator starting up from the next property. Ranger barked once, sharply, and Emily spun around. That sound, if they've nested nearby, vibrations like that might trigger movement. Tom looked concerned. "That property belongs to Dale Kramer. Retired fire chief. Keeps alpacas." Emily pulled a radio from her belt. "I'm calling in backup. If one snake got this far, the others might not be far behind." As she spoke into the receiver, Tom glanced down at Ranger, who was now pacing in a slow circle, ears twitching, nose to the wind. He smells something, Tom murmured. Emily ended her call. We're not waiting. I'll come back tomorrow with drones and heat sensors, but if Ranger's on alert, we walk the ridge tonight. Quietly, Tom picked up his rifle again. You ever walk forest lines in Montana dusk, Miss Dawson? Emily gave him a half-smile. I've walked worse, but I've never had a partner like him. As the three moved toward the edge of the pasture, the last light of day began to fade. The trees cast long fingers across the land, and the air grew colder. Ranger walked ahead, each step a warning, each pause a question. Whatever was out there, it had returned, and this time it wasn't alone. The morning sun broke through the pines like golden spears, illuminating the dew-drenched grass of Tom Walker's pasture. It had been 2 days since Emily Dawson's visit, and the air in Bozeman, Montana, had shifted from crisp autumn coolness to a tense stillness, like the earth itself was holding its breath. Birdsong had grown scarce. The cattle were skittish, and Ranger, ever silent, ever watching, had not left the ridge line above the southern creek since the night Emily received her radio call. Something was changing. Something was coming. Tom stood near the fence with a mug of coffee gone cold, his eyes following Ranger's silhouette as the dog paced along the edge of a small bluff that overlooked the grazing field. Below, about 24 sheep lazily fed on the thick grass near the banks of a shallow lake, an area Tom usually avoided for grazing due to how secluded it was. But after the discovery of drag marks and Emily's confirmation of escaped pythons, he'd brought the herd closer to the house in hopes of keeping things contained. It hadn't worked. That morning, as Ranger gave his usual low bark from the ridge, Tom felt something crawl down his spine. It wasn't the cold. It was instinct. He set down his cup and reached for his rifle. Meanwhile, Emily had returned. She now worked out of a makeshift research tent erected near the barn, complete with a portable wildlife monitor, field laptop, and 2 trail cameras feeding thermal images from the grove to her screen. She was crouched near a set of fresh tracks, snake slides mixed with something else. Larger. Closer. Her jaw clenched. We've got at least 2 more out there, she muttered, standing and brushing her knees. And they're hunting in tandem. At that exact moment, a sound snapped across the valley like a wire under strain, a short, sharp clicking bark from Ranger. Tom turned, rifle raised, scanning the ridgeline. Ranger stood perfectly still, tail low, ears pinned forward. His mouth opened slightly, and he released a second clicking bark, this one higher in pitch. Emily froze. What is he doing? Tom blinked. Calling. Before Emily could respond, 3 blurs emerged from the far side of the treeline. Dogs. The first was a sleek black border collie with white forepaws, her movements graceful and exact, ears flicking with the discipline of an old soldier. Her name was Maggie, and she belonged to Carl Boyd, a neighbor who used her to herd sheep on the next ranch over. The second was Cooper, a yellow Labrador retriever with a wide chest, chipped left ear, and an enthusiastic energy that seemed too cheerful for the moment, until he took position to the right of Ranger, tail stiff, nose quivering. The third was a stocky blue heeler named Bo, his fur dusted like storm clouds, one eye cloudy from a fight with a mountain lion 3 years back. He was the oldest of the 3 but walked like a tank, placing himself to the left of Ranger without hesitation. Emily stared, dumbfounded. They came because he called? Tom nodded slowly. We've seen it before. They don't just work, they communicate. Down below, the sheep continued to graze unaware. But the tall reeds near the lake's far bank rustled unnaturally, once, then twice. Ranger's head dropped a fraction of an inch. His front paw moved slightly, then tapped once. Without a word spoken, the 4 dogs shifted formation, each one spacing equidistant from the other in a curved half-moon arc that gently pressed the herd away from the reeds and back toward the incline behind them. They didn't growl. They didn't bark. They moved like ghosts. Then, the reeds exploded. 2 massive Burmese pythons lunged from the shadows, bodies coiled like springs, tongues flickering. The larger of the 2 aimed straight for the flank of the flock, while the other veered toward a lamb trailing behind. Before either could strike, Ranger burst forward. He didn't attack head-on. Instead, he cut across the snake's path at an angle, forcing it to redirect. As the python turned, Bo lunged from the side, jaws clamping down just below its tail. Cooper slammed into the body's midsection, and Maggie barked 3 sharp, high-pitched signals, her voice rising above the chaos like a conductor's baton. Emily had her phone out now, recording everything. "This isn't chaos," she whispered. "This is a formation." The dogs didn't fight individually. They flanked, coordinated, rotated. When one disengaged, another took its place like practiced chess pieces. The larger snake tried to recoil and wrap Maggie, but Bo darted in with surprising speed, forcing its attention elsewhere. Ranger leapt atop a rock outcrop and barked once, a short, clipped command. The dogs responded instantly, splitting into pairs and rotating angles. By now, the flock had reached the ridge and were escaping out of the basin. Emily's hands trembled as she filmed. "They're not just reacting," she breathed. "They're communicating in a system." Meanwhile, from the barn fence, Lily Adams watched with her fingers curled tightly around the wood. She wore an oversized flannel jacket and thick mittens, her sketchbook tucked under one arm. "They're not just barking," she whispered. "They're talking." When the last python began to retreat into the brush, bloodied and disoriented, Ranger gave one last bark, low, deliberate, final. The dogs backed off in unison, none giving chase. They returned slowly to their places in the arc, flanking the flock now safely away from danger. Emily finally lowered her phone. "That wasn't luck. That was planned behavior." Lily turned to her. "Can you teach me how to understand Ranger when he talks like that?" Emily knelt beside her. "I don't know if I can, but if anyone can learn, it might be you." Later that evening, as dusk crept across the valley and Tom tossed another log into the fireplace, Emily played the footage on her laptop. The room flickered with orange light as Ranger lay beside Lily, her small fingers threading through the thick fur at his neck. "They're not just protecting," Emily said. "They're strategizing." Tom stared at the screen. "Then we'd better treat them like the soldiers they are." Because the enemy wasn't finished. By nightfall, the wind had settled into a whisper, curling through the pine trees that bordered the Walker property like unseen fingers trailing across the land. The moon, pale and swollen, hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the pasture, where most of the livestock had been brought into the upper pens for safety. But Tom Walker's sense of caution had not quieted with the wind. Something still felt off. Tom sat in his small study beside the fireplace, a leather-bound notebook open on the table. In careful, blocky handwriting, he made an entry, his 5th consecutive day recording Ranger's behavior. For 37 p.m. alert posture near creek, scent tracking, ignored food again. 7:10 p.m. returned to gate, tail rigid, pacing began. 9:24 p.m. now staring south, no sound made. He paused, looking up. Ranger had not moved from his post near the back door. He'd been there for hours, eyes fixed toward the treeline. The kind of stillness that didn't speak of calm, but of waiting. Meanwhile, across the fence line, Lily Adams sat curled on the floor of her grandmother's porch, holding a flashlight and a silver whistle that dangled from a faded blue cord. She wore a wool coat that hung a little too big on her narrow shoulders, and her cheeks were still flushed from the cold. Her grandmother, Marilyn, was a retired schoolteacher in her 70s, a stern woman with silver hair pulled into a tight braid and a habit of worrying out loud. She had told Lily to stay inside. But Lily had waited until the kitchen light turned off and her grandmother's tea kettle began its usual late-night whistle, the signal that she had gone upstairs. Slipping outside, Lily quietly opened the back gate and whistled low between her teeth. Ranger lifted his head. Lily didn't say a word. She just nodded and turned toward the field. The dog followed her without hesitation. They moved through the pasture like a shadow and its echo. Lily carried a small flashlight, but she kept it angled low, the beam sliding across the grass like a secret. Ranger stopped every few yards to sniff the air, his ears flicking at sounds too faint for human hearing. The night was heavy and silent, except for the distant sound of water from the creek. Then Ranger stopped abruptly. Lily nearly walked into him. The dog's nose dropped to the ground and followed a trail to the east, veering toward a shallow depression where the grass was thicker and the trees hung low. Lily followed without speaking, her hands trembling slightly, more from excitement than fear. She clutched the silver whistle her grandmother had given her, for emergencies only. Tonight, she wasn't sure what qualified. They reached the lowland meadow, where Tom had let some of the younger goats graze during the day. It was empty now, except for one small shape curled near the base of a tree. A kid goat, no older than a few weeks, lay shivering in the moonlight. Its back leg was caught in a twisted root, and it cried out with small, pitiful bleats. Lily took a step forward, but Ranger growled low. Not at her, at something else. She froze, then raised her flashlight just enough to illuminate the tree line. The beam caught something that didn't belong, a serpentine body, massive and slow-moving, coiling its way through the undergrowth. The scales shimmered golden brown, and the snake's head was already lifting from the grass, its tongue flicking in the air. It was a fully grown Burmese python, easily 17 feet long, and it had already chosen its next target. Lily's heart jumped into her throat. The goat cried again. The python moved faster now, undeterred by the light. Its muscles rippled like ropes beneath velvet. Ranger stepped in front of Lily, body low, tail stiff, a growl building in his chest like a storm gathering in the distance. Then he moved. Ranger launched himself forward, using a nearby boulder to vault into the air. His body curled mid-leap, spinning so he landed not on the snake's head, but directly along its spine, claws digging into the thick muscle. The python convulsed in shock, trying to wrap around him, but Ranger twisted, using the length of the serpent's body as leverage. He bit down just behind its skull with surgical precision. The snake hissed and coiled violently, flinging Ranger to the side. He hit the ground but rolled to his feet immediately. The python slithered forward toward the goat, but Lily was already moving. She dropped to one knee and pulled the whistle from her coat. Her fingers fumbled for only a second before she brought it to her lips and blew. The sound sliced through the meadow like a siren, sharp, high-pitched, disorienting. The snake jerked its head, momentarily distracted. That was all Ranger needed. He charged again, this time going for the midsection. He sank his teeth deep, shook violently, and pulled with his entire body weight. The python recoiled backward, tail thrashing, but Ranger held on, dragging it away from the goat and toward the creek bed where the terrain worked in his favor. Uneven, broken, impossible for the serpent to coil properly. Lily scrambled forward, freeing the goat's leg from the root. It limped slightly but managed to stand. She turned and blew the whistle again, urging it back toward the pasture. The kid obeyed, bleeding as it disappeared into the darkness. Behind her, the battle raged on. Ranger had pushed the snake into the creek itself now, using the water to slow its movements. The python reared up to strike, but Ranger darted sideways, then leapt forward once more. He struck its neck again and again until finally, the snake recoiled, hissing, and slithered back into the reeds, vanishing into the current like a ghost pulled downstream. Ranger stood at the edge of the water, chest heaving, soaked and shaking. Lily ran to him, kneeling at his side. She reached out a trembling hand. Ranger looked at her, and for the first time, pressed his snout against her palm, licking it once, then resting his head gently on her lap. She didn't flinch. They stayed like that in the dark, under the moonlight, the silence filled not with fear, but trust. The moon hung high over Bozeman like a quiet sentinel, casting its silver light across the wide pastures of the Walker Ranch. The usual nighttime stillness had given way to a tense hum, an unnatural silence broken only by the occasional chirp of crickets and the distant rustle of wind brushing across the tops of pine trees. Even the cattle were quiet, clustered tightly behind the reinforced wooden fencing near the barn. Something was watching. Something was moving in the dark. Tom Walker stood on his porch, shotgun in hand, his weathered face stern beneath the wide brim of his felt hat. He'd fortified the main gates earlier that day, added spotlights to the barn roof, and posted trail cameras along the fence line. But despite the precautions, his instincts, honed by decades of ranching, were screaming. Beside him, Ranger sat still, his golden brown coat reflecting the moonlight in a pale shimmer. His ears twitched. His nose lifted. Then his body tensed. "Talk to me," Tom muttered. Ranger let out a low growl and stood, eyes locked on the northern edge of the sheep enclosure. The dog took a single step forward, then barked, short, sharp, and precise. From the shadows to the left of the barn emerged Buddy, a 3-year-old beagle mix, small in size but wiry with big, intelligent eyes and a scar that ran diagonally across his right shoulder, a memento from an old coyote ambush. He had belonged to Tom's late neighbor, an elderly woman named Clara who'd passed away the previous winter. Since then, Buddy had made the Walker Ranch his new home, following Ranger everywhere like a small shadow with too much courage packed into too little body. Ranger barked again, 2 quick bursts. Buddy immediately darted toward the eastern fence, tail stiff, ears perked. At the same time, 2 other dogs arrived from the nearby pastures. Maggie the border collie, ever graceful, flanked the left side of the sheep pen. Bo the blue heeler appeared next, taking the western slope. The team was assembling, but something about Ranger's posture made Tom frown. This wasn't a patrol bark. This was war. Then it happened. 2 shapes slid from the brush in opposite directions, smooth and deliberate, scales glinting under the moon. 2 massive Burmese pythons, their bodies thick and winding, moving with silent intention. One headed straight for the sheep pen's side gate, the other toward the western grain shed, where several young lambs were huddled. Tom's breath caught. He raised the shotgun but hesitated. The dogs were already in motion. Ranger took the center. With a bark that sounded more like a command than a warning, he split the group. Bo and Maggie veered left toward the first python. Its path curved like a river, aiming to encircle the pen. Buddy, to everyone's surprise, took the right flank, alone, charging toward the second snake, smaller but faster. Ranger followed close behind. The pasture became a blur of fur and scale. The larger snake was nearly 20 feet long, its head the size of a shovel blade. It lunged at Maggie, who dodged and barked furiously, drawing its focus. Bo rammed its midsection from the side, slowing its coil. The 2 dogs worked in tandem, forcing it into an awkward position near the water trough. Meanwhile, Ranger and Buddy confronted the second python. This one moved quicker, more aggressively. It reared and struck. Ranger dodged and lunged, biting the tail and pulling it back. But the snake twisted violently, its body snapping like a whip. Buddy was knocked sideways, yelping in pain, then scrambled to his feet and circled behind it. The snake shifted targets. With terrifying speed, it looped back toward Ranger, caught his hind leg mid-leap, and began to coil. Ranger struggled, snarling, teeth flashing, but the constriction began, thick muscle wrapping around his lower body, squeezing. He barked once, high-pitched and pained. Tom sprinted forward from the porch, yelling, shotgun raised. "Ranger!" Before he could get within firing range, a blur shot out from the shadows. Buddy, limping, blood on his right ear, launched himself onto the coiling mass, biting hard into the snake's tail, refusing to let go. His small frame was almost comical against the size of the serpent, but his teeth held like steel. The python whipped its tail violently, trying to shake him off, loosening the grip on Ranger just enough. Ranger twisted free, gasping, dragging himself back. His hind leg was swollen, limp, but he didn't retreat. With a growl of rage and pain, he lunged again, this time aiming for the neck. He struck true, driving the snake backward into the cold dirt. Tom fired once, into the air. The blast echoed through the valley. The larger python near the sheep pen recoiled immediately, slithering back into the trees with Maggie and Bo nipping at its tail. The second snake, now overwhelmed by Ranger and Buddy, released its attack and retreated, disappearing into the tall grass near the creek. Ranger stood over the retreating shape, breathing heavily, legs shaking. Buddy lay beside him, panting, bleeding, tail wagging faintly. Emily arrived moments later in her SUV, headlights cutting across the pasture. She jumped out wearing a fleece-lined coat and thermal gear, carrying her field radio. "What happened?" Tom pointed to the shadows. "2 of them. They coordinated. One almost got Ranger." Emily crouched beside the German shepherd. "He's hurt." "He stood his ground," Tom said. Even after. Emily looked up, eyes wide. "I'm calling federal support. We're past containment now. This is coordinated predation." Back at the house, Lily stood on the porch with a small bundle in her hands. She ran down to meet them, eyes wide as she saw Ranger limping beside Tom. "He's okay," Tom reassured her, "but he's going to need rest." Lily nodded, then pulled a deep red bandana from the bundle, soft, stitched by hand, with white thread forming the word guardian in blocky, slightly uneven letters. "I made it for him," she whispered, "because that's what he is." Ranger sat and allowed her to tie the scarf gently around his neck. Then slowly, he leaned forward and licked her hand, just once. Tom watched, notebook forgotten in his pocket. The pastures had turned into battlegrounds. And his dog had become a symbol. The night air in Bozeman had grown sharper, tinged with the kind of chill that hinted at the first snow. Clouds moved slowly across the moon, dimming and revealing its light in waves, casting shifting shadows over the pastureland. Tom Walker sat at his kitchen table, the clock ticking past 11 p.m., but sleep wasn't even a consideration. His boots were still on, laces loose. A lantern flickered near the window, and beside it sat his open notebook, filled with the scrawled observations of a man who now believed, fully, that something extraordinary was unfolding on his land. Ranger lay near the back door, the red bandana tied loosely around his neck, one hind leg still stiff from the constriction injuries 2 nights earlier. Yet his posture betrayed no weakness. His ears twitched with every movement outside, and his eyes, those deep, knowing eyes, were alert, fixed on the darkness beyond the porch. Tom had learned to trust that look. Across the room, Emily Dawson was hunched over a portable wildlife scanner, her lips tight, fingers rapidly scrolling through heat map data collected from 3 thermal trail cameras positioned near the creek. The screen lit up with flashes of yellow and orange. Her jaw clenched. "They're moving again," she whispered. Tom stood. "How many?" Emily turned the screen toward him. 3 distinct heat signatures. Large. Slow. Coordinated. They're heading northeast, toward the edge of town. Tom exhaled through his nose. "Too close to people." "I've already alerted fish and wildlife," she said. "But they won't be here for another 45 minutes. Ranger stood. The other dogs appeared as if summoned by thought. Bo limped in first, one eye milky but burning with awareness. Behind him came Maggie, her lean black and white form perfectly still, awaiting direction. Buddy followed closely, ears perked despite the bandage wrapped around his chest. Then Cooper, solid and golden, tongue out but eyes focused. Lastly, a newcomer trotted in behind them. Duke, a tawny Anatolian shepherd, easily 130 pounds, thick-coated and heavy-jawed. He was 6 years old and belonged to the Jenkins family, who ran a ranch 3 miles west. Duke had been raised among sheep, trained to protect not by barking, but by presence, silent, massive, immovable. He had scars across both flanks and a deep cut in his right ear, long since healed. Tom narrowed his eyes. "You weren't called Duke." Duke didn't flinch. He simply sat beside Ranger and waited. Emily's brows furrowed. "They're forming up again." And just like before, Ranger moved first. He took a single step toward the back door, barked once, low and short, and the others followed. They didn't wait for orders. They didn't ask permission. They knew. "They're going to intercept," Emily said, her voice equal parts awe and dread. Outside, the night swallowed the dogs as they fanned into formation. 2 to the left, 2 to the right, Ranger and Duke through the center. No barking. No lights. Just movement. Tom reached for his coat. "I'm following." Emily grabbed her radio. "I'm documenting." What unfolded over the next 25 minutes was later described by experts as a nonverbal coordinated wildlife containment maneuver. But to Tom, it was simpler than that. It was instinct given structure and loyalty given purpose. Ranger led the group toward the southern ridge, his nose low, tracking the thick scent trail left by the serpents. Near the treeline he paused, sniffed, then tapped his paw once on a fallen log. The team responded instantly. Maggie and Buddy veered left through a ravine to flank. Bo and Cooper split right along a rock outcrop. Ranger and Duke advanced directly ahead through tall brush, moving silently but with purpose. Emily and Tom, trailing from a ridge above with thermal binoculars, watched in silence as the heat signatures of the pythons grew clearer. One of the snakes, the largest, had curled near a watering hole just outside the abandoned north paddock. Another slithered up toward a calf shelter. The third was moving quickly, too quickly, toward the fence line of the Davis property, where a toddler's swing still moved gently in the wind. That was Ranger's target. He broke into a run, Duke at his side, no sound but the thud of paw against earth. Ranger tackled the python head-on, not biting immediately, but forcing it backward with his body weight. Duke swept to the side and began circling. The python, disoriented, raised its head to strike, but Bo appeared from the dark, ramming its side, while Maggie darted in from the other angle, snapping at the tail. The ambush was complete. Each dog moved with shocking precision, herding the serpents away from the town boundary, back toward the creek, cornering them in the shallow bend where the muddy banks made coiling nearly impossible. Emily pressed record on her camera. "They're driving them into a containment zone," she whispered. Tom nodded slowly. "Like wolves circling elk. Only smarter." One of the snakes lashed out, wild, desperate, but Buddy bit down on the tail, holding long enough for Ranger to lunge again. This time the python fled, its massive body twisting into the river and vanishing downstream. The second followed. The third, slower, was forced by Cooper and Duke into the same path. No injuries, no fatalities, no sheep harmed, and not a single bark until it was over. As the dogs gathered at the edge of the ridge, Tom and Emily finally caught up. Ranger limped slightly, but his eyes were calm. He walked to Tom, tail low, not in submission but fatigue. Emily knelt and gently placed her hand on his bandana. "You just organized a multi-species coordinated defense," she said. "I don't even know how to study that." From the east, headlights approached, the federal team, too late to witness what had just occurred. The next morning, in Mrs. Langston's fourth-grade classroom, Lily stood at the front of the room. Her voice shook slightly, but her eyes were bright. In her hands, she held a drawing, 6 dogs standing shoulder to shoulder in a moonlit field. One wore a red scarf, and above him floated 3 words in bold lettering: Ranger the Guardian. She spoke not of monsters, but of teamwork. Not of fear, but of instinct and courage. And her classmates listened like it was legend. Because it was. The first snowfall came quietly. It arrived at dawn, blanketing the pastures of Bozeman in soft white, turning the pine-covered ridges into gentle spines of silver and gray. The world, muffled beneath that snow, felt like it was holding its breath. At the Walker Ranch, the barns stood still, their rooftops dusted in powder. A thin line of smoke curled from the chimney of the small wooden house, and from the porch, 2 shapes descended the steps together, one on 2 legs, the other on 4. Tom Walker, wrapped in his heavy sheepskin coat and scarf, walked slowly with a steaming mug of coffee in hand. At his side trotted Ranger, wearing his now slightly faded red bandana that read Guardian, stitched by a child's careful hands. His gait had a lingering stiffness from his previous injuries, but it never broke his rhythm. He didn't limp anymore, he moved with purpose. Across the yard, Lily Adams waited near the edge of the garden path, her cheeks rosy from the cold. She wore a blue knit cap, oversized gloves, and a fleece jacket embroidered with cartoon flowers. Her backpack bulged with school books, but her eyes were fixed on Ranger. "Morning, Ranger," she said softly as he approached. The German shepherd let out a short, warm huff of breath and pressed his head briefly into her hand. Every morning since the patrol, the night of the silent battle, Lily had come to walk with him to the edge of the pasture. They had a new ritual now, 20 quiet minutes of watching the treeline together, just her and the dog. No words, no instructions, and he always came. Inside, the kitchen had been converted into a kind of field office. Papers covered the table, thumbtacked maps spread across the walls. Wildlife tags, thermal printouts, and behavioral charts sat in stacks. At the center of it all stood Emily Dawson, wearing a gray turtleneck under a padded vest, her usually tight bun now undone into a loose braid over her shoulder. She looked younger when she wasn't chasing snakes, though the fatigue in her eyes hadn't faded. She adjusted her reading glasses and clicked to the next slide on her laptop. The video played again, 6 dogs moving across a frosted field, flanking, signaling, surrounding a predator. No leashes, no collars, no commands. Emily paused the screen. "There," she murmured. That moment. Ranger taps the log. Maggie responds. They're communicating beyond body language. This is tactical cognition. The door creaked behind her. Tom entered, shaking snow from his boots. "You're up early." "So are you," she replied without looking up. He moved to the table. "Federal response say anything yet?" "They reviewed the footage. So did 2 universities. I got a call from the University of Michigan last night. Behavioral Science Department wants to send a research team." Tom grunted. "Ranger's not going anywhere." Emily smiled. "I figured you'd say that." She clicked again. The screen now showed headlines. Montana dogs drive off exotic predators without human aid. Then another. Ranger the Guardian. Tactical genius or natural alpha? One image showed Ranger mid-charge, snow in the air, a python recoiling in the background. "Congratulations," Emily said. "You have a national symbol on your porch." "I've got a friend on my porch," Tom replied, and then his voice softened. "One who never asked for fame." Later that week, the town of Bozeman held a modest public gathering at the community center, a celebration more than a ceremony. Locals brought baked goods, children dressed as dogs, and someone even wheeled out a papier-mâché python to be defeated during a reenactment led by Lily and her classmates. Ranger was present, though he sat quietly behind Tom's chair the entire time, tail resting against the floor. He didn't bark when they cheered, didn't flinch when they clapped. He simply watched. At one point, a man in a gray suit approached with a camera crew and a thick folder of legal documents. His name was Craig Heller, a PR agent from a national news network. Late 30s, square-jawed, short-cropped hair, practiced smile. He extended a hand to Tom. "We'd like to license Ranger's story. Books, interviews, maybe a children's animated series. Full rights. We're prepared to offer." "No," Tom said simply. Craig blinked. "I haven't said the number yet. You don't need to." The man looked over at Ranger. "You realize what you're sitting on?" Tom looked too, his gaze softer. "A life. One that's earned peace." Back at the ranch, the snow continued to fall. Emily began preparing a final report for submission to the federal database. First recorded multi-canine coordinated predator response with tactical signaling. She included thermal scans, video, and first-hand notes from witnesses. At the end, she added an addendum. "In my professional opinion, Ranger demonstrates behavior consistent with both leadership and strategic execution previously unrecorded in domestic animals. More than instinct, this dog displays empathy, delegation, and preservation-based tactics. He is not merely responding to threat. He is protecting a world he believes is his responsibility." And still, every night, Ranger walked the edge of the field. Even when the snakes were gone. Even when the media moved on. Even when Emily returned to her regional office. He walked. Sometimes with Duke beside him, hulking and silent. Sometimes with Buddy trotting playfully behind. Sometimes alone. And always, always, with his eyes turned toward the woods. Because some guardians don't sleep. They just wait. Sometimes, the most powerful guardians in our lives don't wear badges or speak words. Sometimes they walk beside us quietly, watching, protecting, and giving everything they have, not for glory but for love. Ranger never asked to be a hero. He simply answered a calling, one that came not from man, but from somewhere higher. This story reminds us that God often sends protection in unexpected forms. A loyal dog, a quiet moment of instinct, a child brave enough to blow a whistle in the dark. It's in these small, unnoticed acts that miracles are born. The courage of a creature like Ranger isn't just nature's design. It is God's grace in motion. A silent prayer answered before it was ever spoken. In a world full of noise, chaos, and fear, let us remember that faith doesn't always shout. Sometimes it walks on four legs, watches the tree lean, and never gives up. And perhaps the true miracle is this, that even when the danger is gone, the guardian still remains. If this story moved you, please take a moment to reflect. Share this story with someone who believes in the quiet power of loyalty. Comment below your thoughts. And if you believe in divine protection, write Amen to stand with those who walk unseen paths to keep us safe. Subscribe to our channel for more stories of faith, resilience, and the bonds that remind us God is still watching over us. And most of all, may the Lord bless and protect you and your loved ones as you walk your own path, guided by the silent guardians in your life. Amen if you believe.